Our scripture reading today comes from the book of Deuteronomy, which is a book full of laws about everyday life. And I call your attention to the 4 laws that you will hear this morning in verses 8 through 11. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Otherwise, you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. You shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, or the whole yield will have to be forfeited, both the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard itself. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. You shall not wear clothes made of wool and linen woven together. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, good morning. It's good to see you all here today. So today we're actually going to be talking about one of my favorite artists. This is a little bit personal to me. We're going to talk about Gustav Caillebotte. Have you ever heard of him before? Gustav Caillebotte? He looks like Caillebotte, right? But that's not how it goes. It's Caillebotte. That's how you say it. And he's an impressionist artist. He's a big reason why my wife and I actually had such an important connection together when we first started dating. I'm going to save that story for a little later on in the sermon, though, but you'll see when I come back to it. So, Caillebotte, how many of you have actually heard of this guy? Anybody heard of who he is? Okay, not a lot. He's not a very well-known artist. He's a member of the French Impressionists, and in fact, prior to the 1950s, his art was really not considered to be all that great. He was pretty much dismissed as an artist. He was better known as a patron of the arts, and he was a man who actually gave a lot of money to the Impressionists who you all know very, very well. He was the one who gave them housing and the ability to do all of their art. But after the 1950s, his work was reassessed by art historians, and now he is considered to be one of the masters of the French Impressionists. So, I want to start off by telling you a little bit about his life. Who was he? Where did he come from? So he was born in 1848 to upper-class Parisian parents. His father owned this military textile business, and it was extraordinarily profitable. And as a result, Caillebotte, he lived a very charmed existence as a child. At the age of 12, for the first time in his life, he started dabbling a little bit in painting and drawing, but nowhere was it on his radar to become a full-time artist. Instead, he went to school, and he ended up becoming a lawyer. And at the age of 20, he opened his own law practice. But then, shortly after opening that law practice, France got into the Franco-Prussian War. He was drafted into a unit known as the Mobile Guard. Now, the Mobile Guard was comprised primarily of wealthy men who had been able to avoid military service thanks to their political connections. But when the Franco-Prussian War came around, they didn't have a choice, so they had to get into it. Then, in 1871, after the war was over, he was discharged, and he started going to a studio of a man called Léon Bonnet. Léon Bonnet. Bonnet was considered to be one of the great artists of his day. He was recognized as being a great artist at that time, unlike many of the Impressionists who were only really recognized after they had died. And he goes to Bonnet's studio, and he starts learning how to do art again under Bonnet, and he turns out to be quite the artistic prodigy, Caillebotte, because within 5 years, he's developed this very refined style for which he would become famous. Now, how many of you drew and did painting and stuff when you were a little kid? Remember doing that? How many of you did that? Some of you didn't. You had, I feel for you in your existence if you didn't have the opportunity to do any painting or anything like that when you were a little kid. Okay, how many of you actually did this when you were a teenager? Like actually actively did your art when you were a teenager? Okay, many less, right? Because we all kind of do it when we're kids. You know, you do your finger paintings and all that stuff. And then when you get to be a teenager, most of us leave it behind. Well, now think about it. This guy, he doesn't do this for his entire adolescence. And then he picks it up again in his early 20s. And he's able to get it back. And this is really remarkable. You have to consider that because most of us, you can't recover from that level of neglect when you don't develop it during your adolescence. But he did. And in the time that he's doing it, he becomes friends with all the rising stars of the Impressionist movement. Degas, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro. These are all his friends. And he starts seeing the work that they're doing, and he's blown away by it, and he wants to make his own contributions to the Impressionist movement. And so in 1876, he's part of what is known as the second Impressionist exhibit, the first one taking place 2 years prior in 74. And he gives 8 pieces to be part of this exhibit. And one of these pieces is his first masterpiece that is called The Floor Scrapers. Now, it's hard to tell on the screen, but The Floor Scrapers is an enormous piece. It's very, very large, and it was considered to be quite revolutionary for the time because he was one of the first artists to ever capture the urban working class, a subject matter that was considered quite vulgar by the standards of the day. If you were going to capture the working class, there were 2 types of people you were allowed to paint. You were allowed to paint peasants and farmers. That's it. This kind of stuff was off limits. But the fact is, it's not just that he captured the urban working class. It was how he went about doing it. Notice in this painting that the men have their shirts off, which is an allusion, actually, to the ancient motif of the male nude. Now, normally, when you have male nudes from antiquity, it's using the subject matter of the men and women of mythology. So this picture of Zeus and Thetis, or this painting of Zeus and Thetis, is a very common portrayal of what you would see when you were dealing with somebody who is a male nude. But that's not what he does. In fact, by portraying him the way that he does, Caillebotte is lifting up these men as being heroes of modern life. And by capturing them in the midst of their work, this is a seemingly random moment in the middle of them stripping the varnish off a floor, probably in his own studio. He captures them in this moment, which would be considered by art critics as a demeaning moment. You never captured somebody in the middle of their work. You always wanted to capture them when the work had been finished. Now that's how the art world looked at it. But when the average person walked in to see this piece, they loved it. Because by showing these men as being strong and muscular, by showing them in the midst of honest labor, he was doing something that nobody had ever seen before. And these people who walked in, they had never had an artist work with them to the point of saying, we want to capture you on a canvas. They had never saw themselves as being worthy of being part of the art world before. Because up to that point, artists, what was their job? Their job was to make things that were beautiful, right? And beauty wasn't necessarily in your average, ordinary work. And so this changed the way people thought about artists. All of a sudden, an artist could very well go out and document the ordinary, everyday life of people. And Caillebotte, he shined a spotlight on the beauty of ordinary, everyday actions. Now, when you see something like Caillebotte in this painting, it raises an interesting question in my mind, which is, does God care about our ordinary, everyday life? This is an interesting thing. He can highlight it through this beautiful painting, right? But does God care about it? Does God care about how you toil at your work in order to earn money to put food on the table? Does God really care about how I write a sermon or how you conduct a business transaction? Wouldn't God be better served by being there at the big moments in our lives rather than sitting there watching us going through our daily routine? I don't know if you've ever thought about this question, but it has a huge impact on your faith. And the answer to the question is not as simple as it may sound. So let's go back to that scripture that we watched, or that we heard Judy read originally. So in the scripture, it's a bunch of laws. And what were you all thinking when you read those laws? What was your initial reaction? Silly, right? Yeah. It's like, what is this all about? This is kind of weird and arbitrary, right? Why does this matter? But you have to realize is that this is from the book of Deuteronomy. It's the 5th book of the Bible. It's part of the 613 commandments. Now, 613 commandments are found in the first 5 books of the Bible. What happens if you add 6, 1, and 3 together, by the way? It's 10. Okay, so 6, 1, and 3, that's 10. All the time, you're looking at this concept of 10 throughout the Old Testament. So you have all these commandments. We read 4 of them. And these are commandments that the Jewish people were expected to follow. So let me take you through a few of them. So the first one we read is it's about putting a parapet around your roof. Now, a parapet is this low protective wall that would actually be up there so that if somebody was climbing on your roof, what would happen if they slipped and fell? They would not fall off, right? Which, of course, I think we can all understand why God would want this, right? Remember, this is God's law, by the way. And I think you can understand why God would want that, right? Because God created gravity, and if you fall, you're going to die. So, you definitely want to get that law in there so that, people don't end up hurting themselves. And so what is this law all about, right? Safety first. That's really what it's all about. Okay, you on the same page with me? Okay, safety first. God knows best in that way, okay? All right, second law we looked at had to do with sowing seeds in a vineyard. And so the law states that you're not allowed to plant two different kinds of seed in the same vineyard. If you do, then you're not allowed to take the harvest from the grapes of that vineyard, and you can actually lose the land as a penalty. Now, that's pretty harsh, right? Wouldn't you agree with that? Now, I think clearly what this law is all about is that God wants us to drink top quality wine. That's very important to God, okay? Because if you have two different kinds of grapes, it's all going to get together. You don't want that, right? You want quality. So just remember that the next time you go to the restaurant and you have to choose between that cheap bottle of wine and the more expensive one, only the best, it's God's law, okay? Remember that. All right. Next law up on the list today. It says that when you plow your field, and I know you all do that all the time, right? When you plow your fields. Okay, you're not allowed to use an ox and a donkey that are yoked together. So if you have two oxen that you use to plow your field and one of them gets sick, don't even think about hooking up that donkey, because nothing makes God angrier than an ox and a donkey working side by side. Which is, of course, why T.C. Anderson and why we don't get along very well here at the church. It's hard for us to sit side by side. He's not here to defend himself, which is so much better, actually, than the first service. He goes, "I'm the ox, by the way. I want you to know that." I said, donkeys are smart. I'll go with that one. The final one that they give to us has to do with fabric. So you're not allowed to have linen and wool mixed together in the same fabric. Not only would it be a horrible fashion mistake, am I right about that? Am I right? Absolutely. Okay, not only would it be a horrible fashion mistake, but I think God is really a big fan of those Christmas sweaters, the wool Christmas sweaters. You know, the ones that your family gives you and it gives you a rash around your neck? Yeah, because that's the way you're supposed to celebrate the birth of Jesus, is with a rash around your neck. Now, I'm making fun of all of these laws, obviously. But I'm doing so for a reason. I'm bringing them up to you for a very particular reason. And that's that these laws, they deal with ordinary, everyday activity. And in fact, these particular laws, they get into minutia that borders on the ridiculous. Would you agree with that? So, does God really care about the kind of seeds that you plant in your field, or the clothes that you wear, or whether you're stupid enough to try to get an ox and a donkey to plow together, which, by the way, is generally sound advice, since, those two animals tend not to work very well together? Do you think it really makes God angry if you don't build a wall around your roof? I mean, what do you think? Do you think God cares about that? I mean, it's in the Bible, so what are you going to do? See, the answer to this question, it's hard because you read it, and our response is, that's ridiculous. And the reality is that God both does and does not care about this. The answer is yes and no. Yes, God does care about your ordinary everyday life, but no, it does not revolve around seeds or cattle. So the laws in the Old Testament, those 613 laws, they have two purposes behind them. The first purpose is what you all know quite well, which is social order. And these are the ones that you all follow, right? Like, don't kill me, don't steal my stuff, that's my spouse, like things like that, right? You all know what I'm talking about. So that keeps everything in order. Then you have the other reason why we have these laws, and that's in order for us to remember God in our everyday lives. If you have to think about God when you're planting seed, or when you're wearing clothes, or when you're building a roof, well, then God's going to feel a lot more present in your life. Would you agree with that? Okay, so these laws are for us. They are not for God. Do you understand what I'm saying? These laws were created for us, not for God. But because we are Christians, We have abandoned the majority of these laws, do we not? Have we not? I mean, we don't think about these things at all. And so as a result, we don't think about God that much in our ordinary everyday lives. We're not like Orthodox Jews who memorize all 613 of those commandments. They know them by heart, and they live them out in their day-to-day lives. We tend to see God as being isolated to certain geographical locations. You remember me talking about this last week. And so a place like a church, right? This is where we think about God. Most of us don't think about God outside of a place like this that often in our lives. And this is problematic, actually. Because if we only think of God when we're in these spaces, then we can end up feeling very disconnected from God. And I know it might seem kind of strange, but if you don't practice seeing God in your ordinary, everyday life, then it's going to have consequences for what happens to you in your life. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, because I want to be very clear about this. So in your everyday life, you have habits that you go through, right? Each and every day. Would you agree with me? You have habits. And those habits, they have a consequence on what happens to you when you enter into a moment of crisis. So let's say you make some mistakes with money. Let's just use that as an example. You make some mistakes with money. These are not small mistakes with money. This is a huge mistake. You could end up losing your house. You could end up losing your car, your job. You may not be able to eat. So you get into this situation where all of a sudden you're in crisis. Now, if your habits up to this point have been to yell, to scream, to blame, to lie, to cheat, to steal, if these are the things that you are used to doing in your life when you are just going through your everyday normal activity, what are you going to do when you come into crisis? You're going to do what you know best. You're going to do what you've always been doing. It is very unlikely in a circumstance like that all of a sudden you're going to develop all the virtues that would allow you to get out of a situation like that. You're not going to take responsibility for your actions. You're not going to do what you need to do to dig yourself out. You're going to do what you know how to do. And the same is true in your spiritual walk with God. So, if you go through your life and you have not practiced seeing God in your ordinary, everyday life, then when a crisis comes up, do you think all of a sudden that you're going to feel God's presence in your life during that crisis? No, you won't. Because if you haven't practiced it, if you haven't been looking for it, then it's a very low likelihood that all of a sudden you're going to feel God there. And this is why so many people, you've heard it happen yourself, you may have felt it yourself, where you say, why has God abandoned me all of a sudden? You feel that God is distant. And it's because if you haven't practiced seeing God in the good parts of your life, then when you get to the bad parts, it's going to be that much harder to see God. And so what I want to end on today is I want to give you some practical ways that you can see God in your ordinary, everyday life. And in order to do this, I want to focus back on Caillebott's work. So, one of Caillebott's most well-known paintings is actually down at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's called Paris Street, Rainy Day. Maybe you've seen it before if you've been down there. Okay, so if you've been to the Art Institute, if you ever want to see it, it's when you go in the front doors, if you go straight up the steps all the way to the top, it's the first painting that you're going to see. It's this big, beautiful painting. And of course, what does it portray? It portrays something that you and I see all the time. It's something that happens every day around the world, people walking outside during a rainy day. And the beauty of this painting is we can actually look at all of the detail. We have time to focus in on the detail. So let's talk about this painting. What do we see? Well, the people who you're going to focus on first are who? The people in the foreground, right? Now, what are they doing? They're looking off to the side, and they see something. We don't know what it is that they see. We can't tell. It's outside of the frame of the painting. But clearly, it's making the woman smile, is it not? So she sees it. She's smiling. There's something going on there in her life. And then if you look behind her, behind the two of them, you're going to see a man carrying a ladder. Now, where's he going? What's he doing? So a ladder, generally, if you're going to take a ladder somewhere, you're going to fix something up high. So maybe he's going to a shop. Maybe he's going to somebody's house. Who knows why he's carrying that ladder, but he's just going to do whatever he needs to do. And then if you look off to the side, you're going to see that there's this young man. He's crossing the street. He's got this downtrodden face. Who knows what he's thinking about, but he looks like he's lost in thought. Maybe he's thinking about his destination. Who knows? Maybe he's thinking about his job, his family. Who knows what he's thinking about? But the point of this is that the way that Caillebotte paints this is that you have this opportunity to look at all of these different people in this scene. And if you're willing to step back and observe the features of just one scene from your own life, you're going to notice all these details. And one of the details that you're going to see is that people are lost in their own little worlds of importance. Isn't that what's going on in this painting? Everybody's kind of lost in their own little world of importance. They're all doing their own thing. And when you look at that, you can see that they all kind of think of themselves as individuals. They're apart from the whole, and they're occupying their own little spheres of influence. Their words, their actions, their thoughts, they don't affect anybody but the people within those spheres. And I would assume that that's how you probably think most of the time too. Your thoughts, words, and deeds, they only affect the people in your spheres of influence, but nothing could be further from the truth. The beauty of Caillebotte's painting, and why I love it so much, is that the way that he captures people in their lives, it gives you this opportunity to see how interconnected we are with each other. If you just take a moment to look at this, you can see that we are not individuals, but we are part of this much larger whole. If you step back and look at the tapestry of your life for just a moment, you're going to see that God occupies the spaces in between. That with all these people who are right there, you can see how God is this connecting force that links us one to the other. That if you're willing to give yourself the privilege to step back from your own little world of importance, that you're going to see how God occupies those spaces and how God is part of your ordinary everyday life. I know this is confusing. Let me explain to you what I mean by it. When I was studying over at Oxford, a friend of mine went over to the Musée d'Orsay over in Paris. And it was there that she saw the floor scrapers. She saw it on the wall, and she stared at it, and she went and bought a print of it, and she brought it back to me from my room at Oxford. She said, I saw this painting, and I thought it was quite beautiful, and I wanted you to have a print of it. Now, you have to understand, on my wall at Oxford, there was literally nothing. I didn't have anything on it. So this is the only thing I have on my wall there, right? So I have it there. I take it down when I go home. I go to Rice for my senior year, and I put it up on my wall again. Again, the only thing I have up there is this one print. So I meet Courtney, my wife, and we go out on a date. She comes back with me to my dorm room, and she sees this print up on the wall, and she says, that's my favorite painting. And she told me about how when she was studying in Italy, she went up with her friend to the Musée d'Orsay, and she saw the floor scrapers, and she said she sat there for nearly an hour and observed this one painting. And she said, I can't believe of all the paintings in the world you could have on your wall, you have this one painting. Now, some people might say that that's fate. Other people might say that it's coincidence. I would say it was neither. You see, in my mind, I believe that night that we went out on that date, that it was an evidence of feeling God's presence in our lives. Because that date was no longer about us. It was really about the fact that this strong connection we felt was the result of all these other people who were connected to us. So when we came together, we knew almost nothing about one another. But all these people on my side and all these people on her side had allowed us to come together to have this intense connection. And that connection that we felt to each other is the result of God being in the midst of all these people who are seemingly separate, but yet allow us to come together into this moment where we have a connection. And so you have to understand that God is like that tissue, that linking tissue in between that keeps us all together. You all look around this room. I know you all look, and you see a bunch of individuals in here. But the fact is, you all are connected together in ways that you do not realize. And that God is actually that connecting force that brings you together. and that if you are willing to step back and take a look at it and really observe it, you will come to see how you are connected one to the other. We have on our wall at my house a print of the floor scrapers. It is not the only thing we have on our walls, by the way. We do have other prints. But every time I look at it, I'm reminded about how God exists in the details, in those spaces in between our individual spheres of influence. And so my prayer for you today is that you might see God as that connecting force that links us one to the other. That you might not see yourself as an individual, but rather as part of this much larger whole. And I hope that you will take the opportunity to step back from your own little world of importance that we all have and observe the tapestry of your life, because in doing so, I think you might actually be able to experience God's presence in your ordinary, everyday life. Amen.